Six Flags, New Orleans. No author. It was a warm summer's day when I arrived in Louisiana for a much-needed vacation. As a thrill-seeker, I couldn't resist the allure of exploring the abandoned Six Flags New Orleans theme park. Tales of its eerie atmosphere and haunting presence had piqued my curiosity, drawing me towards its dilapidated gates. As I stood before the remnants of the once thriving theme park, a shiver crawled up my spine. The devastation left by the once deadly Hurricane Katrina in the year 2005 was evident in every decaying structure and twisted piece of metal. The dilapidated park seemed frozen in time, a haunting reminder of the forces of nature that had torn through this place. Unfazed by the cautionary whispers, I stepped inside the forsaken park, the sounds of my own footsteps echoing through the desolation. The ride stood as skeletal remains, mere remnants of their former glory. Vines and foliage had claimed the once lively grounds, an eerie testament to nature's reclamation. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with an eerie energy. Whispers seemed to ride on the wind, carrying the sorrow and anguish of the past. I pressed forward, unable to resist the allure of exploring this ghostly landscape. As I wandered deeper into the park, an unexplained chill filled the air. Shadows danced along the decaying structures, creating an unsettling ambience. My heart raced, a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. It was then that I noticed a flock of ethereal figures emerging from the mist. Their forms flickered, translucent, yet filled with an unmistakable presence. They drifted aimlessly, with their forms creating a haunting reflection of the souls lost to the fury of Hurricane Katrina. These were the ghosts of Hurricane Katrina's victims, forever trapped within the park's boundaries, their presence radiating a mix of sadness and unrest. Their mournful cries filled the air, echoing through the abandoned corridors. Amidst this ethereal assembly, I caught a glimpse of predatory alligators slinking through the overgrown vegetation. They slithered through the stagnant waters that had filled the park, transformed by the chaos of the storm. The once mundane reptiles had morphed into sinister creatures, their eyes glowing with an unholy hunger, with the reminder that nature had not been the only force to leave its mark on this forsaken land. Fear gripped me, but my curiosity pushed me forward. Deeper into the park, the air grew thick, suffocating, and I felt a presence looming nearby. I encountered a looming demon materialized from the shadows, its form towering and grotesque. Its figure extruded darkness and malevolence. Eyes as red as the fire of hell burned into my soul, freezing me in place, and a wicked grin twisted the demon's features. This ancient evil, drawn to the remnant of human suffering, lurked within the decimated park, feeding off the darkness that clung to the land. The demon's presence seemed to distort reality itself, warping the very fabric of the park. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, fear coursing through my veins. I knew I should retreat and escape this malevolent realm, but something held me in place, a morbid fascination with terrors that surrounded me. Suddenly, the piercing sound of a siren cut through the air, shattering the eerie calm. Flashing lights sliced through the darkness, and before I knew it, I was surrounded by law enforcement officers. Panic surged through my veins as I realized I'd been caught trespassing. Police officers emerged from the shadows, their expressions cold and unforgiving. They pointed their flashlights at me, suspicion etched across their faces. "You're trespassing," one of them declared sternly. "This park is off limits. You will be arrested." They wasted no time in apprehending me, handcuffs closing around my wrists, ensuring that I would never return to the haunted realm of Six Flags, New Orleans. The ghosts, alligators, and the demon watched silently. Their ethereal gazes followed my departure. Locked away in his cell for 6 groaning months, I couldn't shake the nightmares that plagued my mind. The haunting images of the ghostly figures, the primal terror of the demonic presence, it all consumed me, putting me to near death. The park's darkest secrets had taken hold of my very being, leaving me forever marked by its sinister allure. I urge you, dear reader, to heed my warning. Never underestimate the power of nature's fury and the echoes it leaves behind, and never be tempted to explore the abandoned ruins of Six Flags New Orleans, where the spirits of the lost, the hunger of the alligators, and the presence of the malevolent demon await those who dare to trespass upon their forsaken domain. Story 2, Red Moon, written by Avenging Angel. On July 18, 2020, NASA launched a new vessel. 6 astronauts boarded Goliath 1 and set off to prepare the first human colony on the moon. The preparations were expected to take a year, but the vessel carried 6 months of additional food past the expectation in case of emergency. Radio communication was possible only on the side of the moon facing the Earth. The astronauts were told to stay in this area to maintain radio contact. The astronauts had landed on the eastern border of the Serenities. This lunar mare was largely covered in basalt and held few craters, making it perfect for colonization. The goal of the astronauts was simple: map the area for colonization and blueprint the construction of buildings. The only real danger on the moon was meteors striking it, as the moon was devoid of any atmosphere. Any electronic journal of these days' events were to be sent back to NASA, along with any interesting photos or videos. Although it was to be seen if anything exciting could happen, it was the moon after all. The first few months of journals were fairly normal. The astronauts were right on schedule with the predicted progress. They wasted no time to blueprint the area. Everything in a normal town was to be in this future town. A grocery store, a school, a hospital, among other things. Of course, these supplies would need to be sent by other vessels. It wasn't their mission to build anything. Then, on the 17th of September that year, the daily report had not come. It was speculated that it was forgotten, but didn't come the next day either. Radio communication was not successful with the astronauts and was only met with static. The radio tower was seen as working perfectly. It seemed that the astronauts were simply not within range of it. Several missing videos were later recovered from the site. The following is a description of each video. The astronauts were told to label their videos by date, using numbers following the date if more than one video was recorded that day. The first video was labeled appropriately as September 16th, 2020. It was around 10 minutes long, and it was mostly spent examining small craters near the border of the mare. Near the end of the video, the astronauts talk about hearing screeching noises from the crater, but this wasn't audible. The journal sent to NASA for the 16th of September did not mention this noise. The second video is also labeled appropriately as September 17th, 2020. This video was also focused around the craters, specifically near the Bessel crater. This is an exceptionally large crater, over 9 miles across and a mile deep. The plan was to eventually build a bridge across the crater. This video is roughly the same length of the previous video. The astronauts began to take note of the crater when the screeching noise is heard again. This time, however, it is quite audible and it appears to be coming from the basin of the crater. The sound becomes so loud it begins to irritate the astronauts. One of the men looks down over the edge to find the source of the sound. A force unseen by the camera suddenly pulls the astronaut into the crater. His screams are heard briefly before the camera is cut short. The third and final video is labeled Code 7700, please help. The date is unknown, but it can't be assumed it's probably the next day. It begins with an astronaut in an oxygen tent, talking to the camera. He explains in a calm voice that he has been unable to contact the radio. He also explains about how 2 of the astronauts have been horribly slaughtered. At this point, tears start to roll down his face, but he continues a calm tone. The scratching noise from the previous video is heard suddenly and sharply. The camera is knocked to an adjacent wall of the tent, and we listen to the astronaut pleading, followed by a heavy thump. The man continues to plead and cry out for help, stating that he can't breathe. The camera is completely turned away from the man, so it is not seen what is attacking him. We see blood begin to splatter on the adjacent wall. The man continues to scream for help and is now completely bawling. Blood splatters against the wall for a second time, and we begin to hear the sound of bone snapping and flesh being torn from them. His pleas for help suddenly stop, and are just reduced to inane screaming and crying. As blood splatters against the wall, a bit of brown liquid now mixes in with a bright red liquid. The tearing sound has since been replaced with that of squishing and sloshing. The only sound that the man makes now is a quiet death rattle. Suddenly, the man goes silent and several of his organs are tossed near the direction of the wall. Coincidentally, the night of September 18th was a red moon. None of the bodies of the astronauts from Goliath 1 were ever fully recovered. Colonization of the moon has been postponed until further notice. The team sent to investigate the radio communication problems the astronauts were having refused to talk to the public. Of the 4-man repair team, 2 have committed suicide since returning to Earth. While the 3 videos were recovered, a photograph was also recovered. It is still unknown as to what the photograph is. Story 3. The Strangers. Written by Anonymous. My name is Andrew Eriks. I lived once in a city called New York. My mother is Terry Eriks. She's in the phone book. If you know the city and you read this, find her. Don't show her this, but tell her I love her, and that I'm going to try to come home. Please. It all started when I decided around the time that I turned 25 that it was time for me to give up taking my backpack into work. It would make me look more mature, I thought, if I wasn't lugging around a book bag everywhere like a high school student. Of course, this meant I had to give up reading in the subway in the mornings and afternoons since I couldn't quite properly fit my paper bags into a pocket. A briefcase would have been out of line since I work in a factory, and a messenger bag always seems a little, fruity to me. Too purse-like for my liking. I had an MP3 player, which helped pass the time for a while, but when it broke, it would shut down at the end of every song, if I didn't skip to the next track manually. I gave that up too. So every morning I'd sit on the metro for half an hour that dragged on endlessly with nothing to do at all but watch my fellow passengers. I was slightly shy, so I didn't like to be caught at it. So I'd surreptitiously watch people. Interestingly enough, I quickly discovered that I wasn't the only person in the world who was uncomfortable in public. People covered up in various ways, but I learned to see through them. I divided them up into categories in my head. There were some fidgeters who couldn't get comfortable, constantly moving their hands, shifting their weight, moving their legs closer to the bench and then further. They were the most noticeable nervous types. After them were the fake sleepers, who'd taken their seat and practically closed their eyes in the same second. Most of them weren't really sleeping though. The real sleepers shifted more, came awake suddenly at stops or after loud noises. The fakes just zoned from the second they sat until the moment the train pulled up to their stop. Then there were the MP3 player addicts, the occasional laptop people, the people who traveled in groups and talked too loudly. The cell phone junkie who were either very popular or just completely unable to shut up for more than 2 minutes at a time. Just as people watching was threatening to get unbearably boring, I had found my first incongruity. A middle-aged looking man, brown hair, average size and weight, and dressed casually. Oddly enough, he seemed almost too normal. He had no remarkable features, no mannerisms, as if he was designed to fade into a crowd. It was that which led me to notice him. I was intentionally trying to see how people acted on the subway, and he didn't act at all. He didn't even react either. It was like seeing someone sitting in the front of the television, watching a documentary about fish. They aren't excited, aren't engaged, but they aren't looking away either. Present, but not accounted for. He was on the subways in the afternoon. It was more than a month into people-watching experiment before he had caught my eye, because I didn't catch the same subway every day and didn't consistently sit in the same car when I did. I saw him for the first time on a Monday, I believe, and for the second time on a Thursday of the same week. He obviously did catch the same train and sat in the same car, in the same seat. OCD much? I thought at the time, since he had caught my attention so much the first time, I'd watched him more avidly the next. He was, frankly, downright unsettling. He didn't do anything at all. He just sat there, expressionless, head straight no matter what had happened. A woman with a wailing child entered the car and sat right behind him, and still, nothing. He didn't so much as turn his head or frown in annoyance, and that kid was really loud too. By the time the subway reached my stop, I found myself queasy, and when I exited the car, my hands were shaking. Something about that man was wrong. He was, I thought, some kind of freak. A sociopath, maybe one of those quiet guys who, it turns out, has a dozen women's heads in his freezer. The first victim being his mother. I found myself intentionally dawdling after work in the afternoons, stopping to browse in the kiosks in the mall near the subway, even when I didn't intend on buying anything. For a couple of weeks I avoided catching the subway, and when I found myself at that stop when it was pulling in, I made sure to choose a train car as far from that one I'd seen him in as possible. Then one morning I saw another person who set off the same warning bells in my head. A woman, just as plain looking, just as out of place in hustle and commotion around her. The moment I recognized her, I realized later, was when my obsession began. My people watching, which had become a bit of a hobby to stave off boredom, became something of a religion to me. I couldn't even enter a subway or ride a bus without finding myself examining everyone, filling out a mental checklist in my head. Plain clothes of solid colors, no brands? Check. No expression, no casual glances out the window or towards the other passengers? Check. No bags, purses, or accessories? Check, check, check. We've got another one. I started calling them the strangers. I didn't see them every day, even after I started taking the metro more than I needed to, even when I found myself riding buses out of my way in the evenings, but there they were, often enough. Seeing one would set my teeth on edge, making my palms sweaty and my throat feel dry. If you've ever given a speech, you might recognize the feeling. Even though they didn't pay me the slightest bit of attention, I felt like I was on display for them. I could see them, plain as day. How could they miss me? They didn't, though. Not in any way that I could tell. And when eventually my curiosity overpowered my fear, I decided to follow one. I chose the one that I found first, the man in the afternoon subway who'd always kept the same seat. I got on and took a seat behind him. We rode to the end of the line and he rose and walked out before I did. Keeping distance between us, I tailed him, but he didn't go far. He took a seat on a nearby bench as expressionless as always, and I turned a corner and waited, trying to look nonchalant. After a few minutes, the next metro arrived, and I watched him enter it, and I saw him take the same seat. I couldn't find the nerve to follow him again. He hadn't gone anywhere. He just rode the metro to the end of the line, and then what? Rode it back? What possible reason would he or would anyone have for that? It nagged at me. Long after I rode a later train back home and tried to get some rest. I couldn't leave it alone. Not until I could make some sense of it. I found myself more than confused. I was downright angry. Why was this uncanny dude just the most inhumane person, riding subway trains back and forth, going nowhere? The mind, I once read, recoils from certain things because the very sight of them is affront. Spiders set it off in a lot of people, particularly great big ones. They just look wrong to us, alien. That was the effect the strangers were beginning to have on me. They offended my senses. I followed him again the next day, and again the day after that. Every day for at least a week, the two of us made our silent trips together, though only I knew it. By the end of the week, I was following him for hours, until the last train that stopped at my apartment block that night. We rode from one end of the city to the other, then back again. I wasn't people watching any longer. I was person watching, stranger watching. I didn't have eyes for anyone else, though peripherally I noticed more than a few confused glances sent my way. Other than that, we two might have just been the only two people on the planet, for all I cared. I lost my job the next week. My manager was kind and timid, but firm. I wasn't concentrating. I had no focus, wasn't being anywhere near productive. It was also quite a speech, I think, but I could barely hear it all. All I could think about was my New York, my vigil. What would that man, no, that thing on the subway get up to when I wasn't there to keep an eye on him? I left work for the last time at noon that day. Normally, I'd have started tailing my subject at 5:30, but I wasn't sure that he'd be waiting for me. I wished now that I'd pay more attention to that day. Was it sunny? It was summer after all. I could have walked around downtown, maybe checked up on a few pretty girls. I could have had an iced cappuccino and smoked at an outdoor cafe and then gone home. Put my growing obsession out of my head. Found a new job and taken to reading on trains and buses again. Instead, I waited. More than one train goes up and down the line, so I sat in the station for at least an hour until I saw him through a window. I walked into the subway car and noticed that for the first time my skin wasn't clammy. My hands weren't shaking. My heart wasn't pounding hard. I sat for the first time right across from him, directly in his line of sight. Watched him for a change in his face. Would he recognize me? If he did, I saw no sign of it, and I was looking hard. We must have made quite a pair, sitting across from one another that afternoon, staring at and into one another. It was hard not to let the building rage in me contort my face, but with effort, I was able to keep as still and as expressionless as him. Inside, I practically screamed at him. React to me, you freaking a-hole. See me, dang it. I know you for what you are. I didn't, though, and my silent demands weren't answered. Not the first trip around, or the second, or the third, or 10th. We rode far into the night together, and at each terminus we got out together and waited. I sat right beside him on the bench, watching him from the corner of my eye, and still got nothing from him. But two could play that game as well as one. Finally, we made our last trip together. I had him and knew it. Last trip for the night before the train stopped running. I'd always let him get away from me at that point because the end of the line is a long way from my home, and the buses stopped running at the same time as the subways. But this time, I'd follow him. Finally see what he'd been doing when the train stopped running. I'd get some answers. Maybe. The subway rolled on, and the anticipation grew in me. The car emptied out around us slowly, until it was just us two, silent watchers below the city. I fought to keep a manic grin at bay, and the subway train slowed to a crawl. Then, a stop. The end of the line. The strangers didn't move, still didn't react at all. The car stood still, doors open. I could dimly hear the last few stragglers making their way out of the subway station behind us, footsteps echoing in silence. Nothing. The speaker system deigned to let any half-asleep people know that we'd reached the terminus. Still, nothing. And finally I could hear footsteps again. A conductor or something popped his head into each car to make sure it was empty, before taking the train wherever the heck it goes for the night. I didn't take my eyes from my silent quarry. I managed to see the conductor from the corner of my eye when he finally reached our car. He looked in, his eyes roamed over us, and a puzzled look came over his face. He blinked a few times and paused. I waited for him to speak, and the moment stretched out, but then, with a slight shake of his head, he left us. There was a car ahead of ours, and I heard him stop to check that too, and then a few minutes later the train started up again. We rode for a time, and then looped around, and the subway was parked. I could see into the windows of more trains on either side of us, and through their opposing windows into even more. And then, he smiled at me. It was just a small curl of the lip, but that would have gone unnoticed if I hadn't spent the last several hours studying his face. "So," he said in a rough baritone, "here we are." I tried to respond, but couldn't right away. My throat had clamped shut. Terror had filled me. It felt like the whole underground cavern we had just been in had collapsed onto us. I coughed and stammered, and finally managed with a raspy voice to ask the question that had kept me up at night, drove me halfway to madness, and led me to this place and this moment. "What are you?" He ignored me. He stood up and the train doors opened. Then, shockingly, he turned to face me. "Coming?" He didn't wait for an answer, but walked out onto the platform. I scrambled to follow. "Come back, dang it," I shouted. "Talk to me. Who are you? What? Why do you ride this metro all effing day?" He didn't look back or slow his step. I couldn't see his face, but it's safe to guess that he didn't react at all. No more than he had to anything else. I stalked after him, still shouting for a time, but eventually gave up. 5 words was all I was going to get out of him, I guess. We walked along the platform until we came to a junction, then turned. We were now perpendicular to the trains around us. The path ahead was lit from above, but I couldn't see where it ended. The trains on either side of us went on forever, as far as I could tell. Far too many trains to service one city, I realized. It wouldn't have mattered by then, I figured, but I probably should have paid more attention to that at the time. I'm not sure how long we walked. I had a watch once, but it broke. I took out my cell phone at one point, but got no reception down there. All it would show me was that it said no signal. The stranger would stop every now and then and look at a subway car for a minute or two, but then pass on. It took me a while to figure out why, but eventually I saw that they weren't all the same. Long lines of them would be similar, and then we'd come to a different model. It'd be a little bit larger, or smaller, or have a slightly different shape. The cockpits, or whatever you call the front part where the conductor sits, were superficially different as well. I didn't, and I don't know what exactly he was looking for, but eventually he must have found it, because we turned again, and the subway doors opened when my impromptu guide stopped in front of them. We entered and took our seats. "Are you willing to speak now?" I asked him. No answer. I sighed with frustration and seriously weighed the pros and cons of punching him in the face for a time, when suddenly the lights in the car came on and I heard the engine start up. What the heck? He gave me a look that was almost sad. "You're not going to be able to go back." "What are you talking about? Go back where?" Nothing again. The stonewalling a-hole. The train lurched into motion, pushing off in the opposite direction than we once came from, I think. The endless parade of them had thrown off my sense of direction. It rolled for a few minutes and then began to slow as we approached the stop. His vacant gaze grew sharper, and for the first time I got a sense that he was actually staring at me, rather than just looking in my direction. "Be still. Be silent. Don't catch their attention." The train stopped. The doors opened, and they began to flood in. I don't know what I noticed first. The weird clothes, the two long arms with hands that almost brushed the floor, the jet black eyes and the angular faces, or the blue-gray hue of their skin. My eyes took in all of those stimuli, but for a long second my brain refused to process it, and when it did, I was barely able to bite down on the shriek that tried to tear its way from my throat. I thought my heart was going to explode. Heck, I thought I was going to explode. I was like a strummed guitar string. Everything in me lurched and throbbed. My sight grew dizzy, which I was thankful for, and I vomited. My mouth clenched shut, and I forced myself to swallow it, barely managing it. My instincts were screaming his words at me. Be still. Be silent. Don't catch their attention. That day is a blur. We rode the subway car up and down the line, still expressionless, for hours, for days perhaps. It seemed much longer than the lines I knew, the line that I'd followed the stranger along. The hideous things around us seemed to pay us no undue attention, though we must have stood out fiercely. I was so petrified with fear that when we finally returned to the endless caverns of trains, alone I burst into tears. I collapsed to the floor and just sobbed for a long time, the stranger watching impassively. When I gained control of myself, I looked at him imploringly. "Take me home," I croaked. "Please." "I can't," he told me. "Don't know which one of these things would take you back, if any of them do." He stood and walked out into the platform, and I rose wearily and followed him. He spun around sharply. "I think you've followed me enough." The rage I'd felt for him before, that panic had temporarily buried, rose up in me. "What?" I screamed, rushing forward. I grabbed him by the shoulders and with a burst of insane strength, I don't even know what was in me, slammed him up against the side of the metro car. "You son of a... What did you do to me?" I slammed him again and again. "Take me back." He bore it all passively, and soon the flare of anger in me guttered out, leaving me hollow. "Please, I beg of you, take me home." "That's not how this works," he said. "If we stay together, it's more likely that we'll be noticed. Go on your own way, be still and be subtle, and they'll think that you're one of theirs." "How could you do this to me? Why?" He gave me another almost sad look. "I had to. You will too. You get stuck sometimes." He brushed my hands off his shoulders and turned to walk away. I fell to my knees, suddenly out of strength, and watched him leave. At the junction, he turned back to face me. "I'm sorry." And then he was gone. I stayed there, on the cold tiles, for a very long time. I curled up into a ball and wept for a while. After there weren't any tears left in me, I even managed to get some sleep. When I awoke, the subway train I'd come in was gone, off carrying more blue-gray abominations to whatever blue-gray abominations go. I couldn't handle going back there anyways. I tried to find my way back to where I started, to find a subway that I'd recognize, but I wasn't even sure which direction I should have been going in anymore. I walked for an hour, then another. Finally, I found one that might have looked familiar. I was desperate enough to imagine that it did. When I stepped up to the door, it opened for me, and I took a seat. It started up, and in spite of being a lifelong agnostic, I prayed my heart out. The train slowed to a stop. The doors opened, and for a second, I thought I was saved. People. Human beings. I must have been the most devout man in the world. Then I noticed the eyes. Specifically, the third large eye in the center of their foreheads. Well, forget it then, I thought. They were easier to take than the last bunch, though, and I was thankful for that. The third eye blinked independently from the other two, though, and that was nauseating. And then one of them smiled or laughed or spoke with another. I couldn't help but notice that their teeth were sharp and misshapen, and yellow-green with filth. But if I was careful and selectively blind, I could pretend for a stretch that I was home. Until one of them entered with a sandwich in hand, and I realized with a start that I was starving. and I hadn't eaten or drank in what must have been days. The next terminus I came to, I decided to try and find something to eat or drink. I don't know why I waited, but it seemed important to ride to the end of the line. I got there and I could barely bring myself to leave. I'd never seen the stranger leave the underground. I'd never seen him eat or drink either. My stomach would not take no for an answer, though. I steeled myself and tried to keep my face carefully neutral and made my way out into the station proper. And then I got confused. I was looking for escalators or stairs or something like that, but all I saw was holes in the ground, the walls, and the ceiling. Gaping, irregular-sized holes, like I was in the middle of a beehive. What was I supposed to do? Leap into one? It didn't make any sense to me, not until someone came through one. He floated up through the floor and then he floated by me. He frowned for a second, or at least I thought it was probably a frown, but apparently whatever kept him from recognizing me as an alien, and the subway extended at least this far. It did not, unfortunately, allow me to levitate, which seemed to be the only way out of the subway station beehive thing. Swearing, I made my way back down to the tunnel. I was angry, lost, starving, and I had been abandoned to fate that, if it wasn't worse than hell, it was at least twice as stupid or 3 times as nonsensical. I was not in my best frame of mind, which I feel excuses the mistake. Normally I take corners with a wide berth, because everyone knows that if you just dart around a corner sharply in a public place, chances are decent that you're going to walk right into somebody. As I did, I slammed into someone, a woman, and fell to the ground. Without thinking, I reacted like any New Yorker would. Badly. "You stupid lady, watch where you're going!" I realized my mistake even before she did. Her eyes grew quizzical and confused, and when she really noticed me, they bulged with horror. She leapt, floated quickly, back from me and let out something scream-like. A little more yowly than I was used to, but I got the point. Further down the tunnel, I saw alien, 3-eyed, heads turning towards us. I thought suddenly about those sharp, filthy teeth, and just like that I was running. The subway train wasn't there, but there was a walkway along the tunnel, for the repairman, I assume. That's who'd use it where I was from anyways. I took it at full speed, and just kept running until each breath felt like getting stabbed. I stopped, panting, and looked back. The tunnel was curved, so I couldn't see the light any longer, but nobody appeared to be following me. Going back, though, was not an option. I continued forward in the dark for a long time. Eventually, I came to a small opening in the wall and stopped there for a rest. Hungry, despair, and a full-speed terrified run had me left absolutely drained. I probably would have wept again, which seemed to be all I was capable of lately. But it seemed like too much work. I just sat against the wall, legs splayed out, and imagined I was beating that dang stranger to death with a hammer. It was a relieving image. A rat was shuffling around nearby in the dark. Every so often, I would kick out a foot to scare it away, but after a time I didn't even bother with that. Rabies or any other disease it might be curing would be a blessing compared to this endless travel through the subways of strange worlds, lost, destitute, and alone. When it crept near me again, I didn't shoo it off. Even when it reached out and pressed against my leg, I couldn't bring myself to care. Not until a train passed by, and the lights of its car lit up the culvert I was in, and the thing that I thought was a rat. It was rat-like, yes, but not as much as it was a spider-like. If someone had bred the two of them together, the resulting abomination might have almost been as horrible as the thing nuzzling my leg. I shrieked, flung myself up from the floor and booted it like a soccer player would, right into the opposite wall. Its back made a sickening crunch, and I watched it twitch out its last before the final car passed and the darkness returned. And in the darkness, a terrible thought came to me. I wondered if it was edible. I didn't want to, and I gagged just imagining it, but I was so hungry, and there was no guarantee that I'd be able to find food in this place, or ever again. Rat spider was my only option. I held off for as long as I could, but in the end, survival trumped squeamishness. But nothing to light on fire. I picked meat off its carcass and cooked it a little by holding it over the flame, but it didn't help much. Nothing could have. Its meat was foul, more foul than anything you can imagine. I've been that desperate for food since and eaten many questionable things, but nothing has ever been as bad as that rat spider. In retrospect, that is when I became a stranger, before I'd struggled to reach that expressionless state the others had maintained. What I'd taken for a calm was numbness. A sharp rock thrown into a river will, over time, have its edges rounded off by the water beating over it. And what I'd gone through had done the same. Tearing up and eating a monster in the dark, below an alien world, the last of my edges, smoothed. By the time I left the darkness and came back into the tunnel, I was as expressionless and empty as the one who had led me here had ever been. That was not the worst of it, though. The worst came later, the first time I got stuck. The stranger had mentioned it, but in the state I'd been in, I hardly noticed. One night at the end of the line, I was asked to leave the train. The world was one of the close to normal ones. The people were almost human, as I recognized it. They were orange, sure, and hunchbacked, but other than that, they were practically normal. After the last world where the people had been hideously overweight, six-breasted hermaphrodites with no noses, the orange guys were pretty much beautiful to me. I thought at first that the conductor was talking to someone else, but I was the only one in the car, and moreover, I understood him. The oranges certainly hadn't been speaking English all day, but nonetheless, I could understand what he was saying. When I stood, I began to realize why. I couldn't stand up straight. I was hunchbacked, and I saw my reflection against the window as I exited. Orange. I pieced together the rest from there. Stuck meant that I was trapped in this world, for some reason, and stuck looking like them as well, which would be handy if I wanted to take this opportunity to leave the subway station, which is possible most times, but requires a lot of care and is quite overwhelming. Alien worlds are a little revolting, I've found. You try to compare them to your own, but the differences are so vast that it just makes you sick. I left the subway, anyways, because it was clear I wasn't returning to Central Hub, what I'd taken to calling the infinite line of subway trains that night, or any other night. I soon found out. Whatever had let me go unnoticed wasn't working any longer. I considered briefly staying, but this place wasn't home, and it could never be. Even if they looked like me, their culture was bound to be different. That was a lesson I learned before. Even worlds where the people are absolutely indistinguishable from me are fraught with danger. I was once on a world where the people looked just like me. Well, actually they looked Brazilian, but that was more than close enough, and learned the hard way that the gesture to mean hello meant something gravely insulting. Insulting enough that I'd been beaten half to death while a crowd looked on with approval. Besides, even if that place had a culture I could fake, I didn't want to stay. I wanted one of two things: to find my way home or to find the stranger who had sent me to this place and beat the crap out of him. Nothing else would do. So I wanted to move on. I wasn't sure, though, if I could really do some poor sucker the way he'd done me. Could I really force someone else to wander the internal underground like me? It turned out I didn't have to. After a few months, one of them did notice me, yes, and began to follow me for weeks. I very carefully made it seem like I hadn't seen him, just like the stranger had. But I was torn between the desire to warn him away and the desire to bring him to the end of the line so I could leave this dismal world already. The last night he followed me to the end of the line, just as I had once before. He hadn't managed to work up the nerve to sit right across from me, though. And as soon as the train stopped at the terminus, he rushed off. I waited, hoping the conductor wouldn't see me and I could continue on, but to no avail. I left the car and the metro rushed off without me, and I cursed and sighed. As I walked around the corner towards the ticket booth, the young man who had been following me attacked. He had a wicked curved knife and should have caught me by surprise, but I'd been traveling through the hostile alien world for several years. My reflexes were sharp. We struggled, viciously, before I managed to wrestle the knife from him. I don't know how I got it in his neck. I don't think I wanted to kill him. I hadn't even been that angry, remembering my own building rage for so long ago. Afterwards, he lay there, bled out. I got pissed. I kicked him repeatedly, shouting, "You were supposed to follow me!" Kick. I fled the scene of the crime, but not for long. I was there bright and early the next day to catch the first subway of the morning, and that night when I rode to the end of the line, I was invisible to the conductor again. I guess you can either kill them or bring them with you if you want to return to the central hub. I was invisible again, but I was also oranged and hunchback still. I stayed that way until the next time I became stuck. The next time I killed. That one went much faster. I didn't wait for her to follow me. Once I was recognized as a stranger, I recognized her as the next one, and I made my choice. I won't bring anyone else into this. It makes me wonder, though, about the stranger who inducted me. I wonder what he originally looked like, and whether he knew that he could have killed me. I wondered, too, about the others I saw back home, and the rare few I came across since I left. Do they kill them or take them? And whichever one they choose, do they consider it a mercy? I can't bring myself to talk to them, to ask. You're damned either way, and the damned should suffer in solitude. I've killed 15 of them now, and I've gotten pretty good at it. But I've made a decision. I'm done killing. Innocents, at least. Before I returned to the central hub, I filled a backpack with as much paper as I could cram into it, and I wrote this story. Over and over again to be left in as many subway trains as I can. A couple of thousand messages in bottles cast into the sea of steel rails. This is a request and a warning. My request above was that you define my mother and tell her I lie. It's a white lie, don't worry. Tell my mother that I love her and that I'm going to try to come home. It may give her some hope or a small measure of peace. I wish it were true too, but here's the thing. I've been thinking of myself as Odysseus, lost and adrift, looking to return to familiar shores, but I am not lost at sea. I am lost in endless tunnels, the labyrinth. The difference is important because labyrinths are designed, built. Somebody or something made this impossible place, and they must be held accountable for what they've done to me. They cast me as Theseus, not Odysseus, but I won't play that part any longer, either. The strange rules of this place have turned me from the human I began as into something else, then something else again. They've made me a monster, and so I will be their minotaur of this labyrinth, and if I can, I will tear it down around me and destroy those that build it. My warning to you is that you should be very wary in public places of silent, expressionless men and women. Keep your distance. They may kill you, or they may do worse. If you see them, run far and fast. And even more importantly, I warn you, I beg you, don't ride the train to the end of the line.